The following is a presentation from the 9th Annual Humanities Days at Montgomery College. The Human in Humanities, Understanding Ourselves and Others. This year we offered 30 remote events via Zoom. To learn more about Humanities Days at Montgomery College and to access other program recordings, please go to this website.
In addition to the advisement about recording, we'll have a content warning in a little bit as well. But welcome to the 9th Annual Humanities Days at Montgomery College, one of my favorite weeks in the year. My name is Greg Wall, and I'm an English professor at Montgomery College-Takoma Park, Silver Spring campus. And with me today as co-hosts are Professor David Lott and Professor Michael LeBlanc, who are editors of the Sligo Journal. Today we're going to be having some folks share some of their work that's published in the Sligo Journal, and we're going to have some students who are going to be giving interpretations of work from the Sligo Journal, and we'll have some discussions and questions and answers. First thing we probably should talk about is what is the Sligo Journal? So I will turn it over to the editors of the Sligo Journal for that.
Sure. Okay. I'll say a bit about that. So the Sligo Journal has been around since about 2011, and it was conceived as a campus and community journal of arts and letters, and it includes poetry, fiction, and art. It could also include, but we haven't published nonfiction and things like that as well. So that's pretty much it. It's really unique in the sense that students can be published and are published side by side with well-established and long-published poets and people like the Poet Laureate of Takoma Park and things like that. So it's a really unique opportunity in the sense that it really gathers the larger artistic community, both on campus and off. And I really am proud to be a part of it. Did you want to say anything, Dave, that I missed? Professor Lott, excuse me.
Yeah, that's okay. Thanks, Michael. I appreciate that. Yeah, I just want to add that we have a student poetry contest. It's happening right now. The deadline to submit up to 3 poems is the end of November, the last day, November 30th. And if you're interested in that, and I really encourage people to submit. If you're even just a first-time poet, you're uncertain, you're just dipping your toe into the poetry waters, by all means, send us 1 or 2 or 3 of your poems, or if you're an experienced poet. Student poetry contest we run now annually. The poem that is determined to be the best poem that we receive, the first place gets a $100 gift certificate to the college bookstore, and second place gets $50, and both first and second are guaranteed publication in the spring edition of the journal. And if you want to submit, I don't know, maybe Professor Wall, I don't know if you could put this in the chat real quick, maybe. It's david.lott, that's 2 T's on Lott, at montgomerycollege.edu. And I can repeat that again. I'll do that quickly now, maybe at the end, if necessary, I can do that. So it's david.lott, L-O-T-T, at montgomerycollege.edu. And if you're submitting, send it to that address, but also please in the subject line, thank you very much, it's in the chat now. You can scroll back and see that. Also, please, in the subject line of your email, just write the words poetry contest. And also, if you could include a word attachment with your poems, 1, 2, or 3 poems. That would be great, as well as the poems appearing. They should appear also in the text of the email. So we have it in both places. And sometimes students say, well, what are you looking for? Well, we're quite open-minded. I would say any kind of form or any kind of style. Professor LeBlanc, I think safe to say you would agree with that. Yeah, we're quite flexible in terms of style and form, but I would say you don't want to submit something really long. It should be, 1 or 2 pages and not beyond that, because we're trying to get as many folks in as possible. Even if you don't, even if your poem is not selected as one of the top 2 for the contest, you still qualify to be considered. Your poem is considered for publication in the journal, and we get most of our student publications that way. And I'll just say one more thing. Don't mean to take up too much of your time here, Professor Wall, but I do want to add that the prizes are sort of only the beginning. In other words, what I mentioned, the gift certificates to the college bookstore, those are sort of Montgomery College level prizes. And in fact, Professor LeBlanc submits the journal to a national competition every year. And sometimes we have poets, student poets and writers, fiction writers, win awards. In fact, pretty recently, Neoma Kanu won the first prize for our contest, poetry contest, and then went on to win first prize in a very competitive Eastern Division. You can imagine how many colleges there are with literary journals in the East Coast of the US. So that was great. And we had a second place, Jeremiah Towell, in a work of fiction that he submitted and that we published. So, the sky's the limit in terms of, getting a very nice recognition for your work as well as publication. So thanks, Professor LeBlanc, Professor Wall, for letting me to jump in there.
Yeah, like I said, I'm about over the Zoom now. I was hanging tough with it for a while, but I'm about over it. I'm ready to be in a room with people, and we will be in January. And that leads me to say something that I say to every time I'm in any group of people anywhere. I'm glad I'm vaccinated. I hope everyone is vaccinated and gets vaccinated as mandated by Montgomery College, and I'm looking forward to being in a room with students and faculty and staff in our community in a really safe way. So I strongly encourage anyone who is worrying about it to go ahead and get vaccinated. And I'm always available to talk about that with anybody if they want to. And I know that many other Montgomery College constituents are as well. Okay. So that said, and one more little advisement that I have, we do have kind of a content warning today. The poems that we will see today, and some poems in general in the Sligo Journal, deal with some difficult topics: death, suicide, murder, violence, things like that. And that's because, as my students have noted as they're reading through the Sligo Journal, it gets real. And so these are works that deal with real life, and so you will be hearing things that don't shy away from that stuff. So I'll just say, take care of yourselves today, and take breaks if you need to. That's totally fine. Okay, so let's move on to an exciting part of our program today. We will have some faculty members. There's at least one in the house. I know at least one other is arriving late today, and we'll see how that goes. But we're really lucky today to have Katima Lee with us, Professor Katima Lee, to read her poem from the Sligo Journal, which is a fantastic poem and is from her book, Transcript of the Unnamed, which is just a wonderful, wonderful book. I enjoy it as well because it's Washington, D.C. and DMV centric. I'm at 16th and R Northwest in D.C. right now as I'm talking to you. So we're going to pull up that poem. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but there's just a question in the chat. Says, if we are, this is from a student, I take it, if we aren't prepared to handle these difficult topics but have to be here for class, what should we do?
I understand. That's a great question. And I would say that as we're talking today, if you feel the need to take breaks, I would encourage you strongly to do so as the person running this meeting. If after the meeting you feel like you might have missed things and you'd like to talk with me about it, my email is available on the Humanities Days schedule, and I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards and fill you in on anything that you might have missed.
May I add something?
Yes.
There will also be a recording of this available. We're not quite sure how soon, but yeah, that Deborah said the same. Professor Taylor said the same thing. So I will have a recording actually right after this. So if you really need to review it later, you could do that as well.
Good. Excellent. Okay. So, Professor Lee, the floor is yours, and I don't know if you want to introduce this in any way or just read it or whatever, but we're all ears.
Okay, I'll just read it. I think the poem kind of speaks for itself, so I'll read it and look forward to hearing from students about it. Okay. My father was an imposing man. Most times he used his size to intimidate. Like Goliath to David, he forced men and women to stand in his shadow, to feel the cold shade of his presence. But I never cowered. My seemingly fragile frame hid the strength of Amazons. From my father, I learned to never fear men, or fear the loss of light some may bring, or the dark that comes when a man stands, like my father, to force uneasiness. Defiance is meeting every giant eye to eye, without focusing on arms or hands threatening to limit. Defiance is not letting the death of a woman who blew smoke in the face of a smaller giant break you, or to lose your courage to the truth that even young or aging bodies will never be safe in a world where confiscating rocks and slings trumps everything. Resisting is living between the pendulum of elegance and a shotgun to the face.
Thank you. A wonderful poem and a perennial favorite for students to write about in their essays. I think what we'll do now is we do have some student interpretation coming, but we were going to start that with interpretation of another poem that we haven't heard yet. So I think maybe taking some questions or having some questions for Professor Lee about her poem. And then we also, I know that I have some students who are working with this poem in a compare-contrast interpretation of poems from the Sligo Journal. Very challenging assignment, but a very rewarding one. So I'd be curious to see what questions we have for Professor Lee about this poem. You can put them in the chat or unmute yourself and just speak verbally if you like.
Could they also be maybe comments for Professor Lee as well?
Of course, questions, comments, appreciations.
I can start a little bit. Yesterday in my fiction writing class, this is more of a connection, I guess. There was another event that I brought into my fiction writing class on storytelling and domestic violence. I don't know if anybody here was able to attend that, but there was a lot of sort of storytelling poetry that had some interesting connections, I think, with some things I'm seeing here as well. I mean, it's a tough topic, and it was a tough topic to bring into class yesterday. And that's both a connection between events, but also just, an acknowledgement that this is challenging. It can be challenging for folks to talk about. And thank you for putting it into poetry, Professor Lee.
And I have another place to get us started possibly as well. One of the things that I always think about when I hear this poem or read this poem or see student interpretation of it, which I have many times now over the past few semesters, is the mix of the really close-up personal and the kind of broad national or political, if you want to call it that, thinking and expression in the poem. And I wonder if you would talk about how that worked for you as the poet.
Well, I think for me, a lot of the time I enter into my poetry through my own personal lens, my own personal experiences, and then I might bring in a speaker, and then the speaker takes off from there. I think the poem is, especially for political leaning poems, I think it's difficult to sometimes enter into that discussion because it can be divisive, and for some people it might shut them out of the poem. But I think it's important to address these topics. And if we address them through our own personal experiences, that's great. I think it's a way to start the conversation. With this poem in particular, I think the whole situation with Sandra Bland really shook me. And so it was interesting that, I started off talking about my father and it led me to Sandra Bland. But I think in a lot of situations when we think about authoritative figures, mostly in a patriarchal society, it's the man, he's dominating, basically, taking away that light that we see otherwise. And so for some reason, Sandra Bland just came out through me talking about my father and how controlling he was. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
100%, yes. And I put the name Sandra Bland in the chat as well, both for people to look up if you don't know, but also to say her name. It's a name that we heard on the streets a while back, sometime during Black Lives Matter protests and uprising. A question on the chat from Maisa. Generally, would you say you write poetry from a personal or emotional place? Is it mainly your own experiences that inspire you to write?
I think for me, when I started out writing poetry, it was mostly from a personal place. I think, a lot of beginning poets start out there writing about what happens to you in your day-to-day life and that sort of thing. And then as I got older and I started taking classes and studying poetry, I started to take myself out of the poems, and it was more about what a speaker had to say about a particular image or subject or something like that. For me now, it's a mix of the two. I like to sometimes infuse my own personal experiences, but also, like I said, the speaker enters into the conversation, and often it might start with me and end with the speaker, or start with the speaker and end with me. But I think it's a practice that works for me and my poetry personally, because I like to share sometimes difficult experiences, because I think it helps others to feel like they're not alone, and also feel like they can enter into writing about poetry and their experiences if they want to as well. Poetry is not meant to shut anyone out, and I think for a long time people felt poetry wasn't accessible, wasn't accessible to them. And so I like to write what I call accessible poetry, and a lot of that has to do with personal experiences, and maybe emotions to a certain extent. But for the most part, I try to take emotions out of it, especially when I'm trying to speak through the speaker's voice of a poem, if that makes sense. It's complicated, I guess, is the short answer. I think it all depends on the subject. It depends on the day. It depends on my project. If I'm working on something that is more about a speaker's experience than my own, then it's not necessarily from an emotional place. It's from a place where I've done some research.
Thank you, and thank you from my teacher self. Thank you for mentioning the idea of the speaker. And so, are we to understand that everything you say in your poetry is not necessarily from you, Katima Lee?
Right, right. Yeah. Some poems have a little bit of me personally in there, but there are others that, are just a speaker, writing about a particular image or theme or something like that. Don't assume it's always the poet when you read a poem. Sometimes it's coming from a different place.
Have you ever written any poems where where you're writing the poem and you think like, that's not me at all, like that's the opposite of me? Do you ever write poems that there's not you in there, it's totally someone else?
Yeah, I actually do that often. And one thing happened in one of my workshops I went to with Gregory Pardlow some time ago when I was at Callaloo. And he and a lot of other people in my poetry workshop said, you're always so distant, where are you in the poem? And so that's when I started to enter my perspective more into my poetry, because I was someone who primarily wrote through a speaker's voice. I didn't always put myself in the poetry. So my books, my chapbooks and my book that I recently released, those are more personal than my previous work might have been.
Thank you. Other questions for Professor Lee? I do have one you won't be surprised to hear, but I will try to exercise some restraint and let others go first for once.
I was just wondering which one you prefer more. Do you like to write from a more personal experience, or do you like to research and kind of have someone else or something else shine through you? Or do you prefer a mixture of both, like you said? What's your favorite?
That's a good question. I think I prefer both now after, practicing that technique. I prefer both. In the past, I would say I preferred leaving myself out of it and just researching, because a lot of poetry, if you're putting yourself into it, can be very, very personal. And so when you're putting yourself out into the world, then you're basically subjecting yourself to possible critique of your own personal experiences, right? And who wants to hear someone criticize how they live their life and all the different experiences that they had? So it's a little bit scary to put yourself out there, but I think when you marry the two, when you have, the academic, I guess, perspective, where you're doing some research and you're approaching your subjects through that lens, and then also putting yourself in there, the personal, it's kind of a marriage of like what we learn about, in the second wave of the feminist movement, which is the personal and the political, right? We're combining the two to send a message out to everyone that, our personal experiences matter, we matter, we're here. And also presenting some issues that are current, like Sandra Bland, things that people might not talk about. And I just think marrying the two gives me the platform to do that. Thank you for that question.
Greg, I don't want to ask if a student has another question, but if not, I was going to ask Professor Lee something about the poem. For me, when I think about other poetry that I've seen, there's a little bit, for me personally, of a sort of echo to the poem called "Those Winter Sundays" by Robert Hayden.
Mm-hmm.
Sense that, for example, that poem starts off, Sundays too, my father got up early. Right away, you know that there's a father in the picture. It's partly about that relationship, and also tells you something specific about the father, but also the form. The Hayden poem goes very controlled, 5-line stanza, then a 4-line stanza, then another 5-line stanza. And for me, this poem, Professor Lee, it has a very controlled, despite a poem that could sort of potentially explode somewhere or get more emotional, or it maintains a very careful 3-3-3 tercets all the way through. So I guess is a comment or a question, I'm not sure which, but in terms of form, being consistent with what you want to communicate in the meaning and the content of the poem. Professor Lee, maybe you could say a little bit about that for poets, particularly poets who are starting out and they don't know what kind of form they might want to write with.
Yeah, so I think your comment about form is an interesting one, because I think for me, a controlled form kind of helps to control the emotion of the poem. And so that might be why I tend to fall into these very somewhat neat stanzas. What I used to do as a beginning poet, when I learned about iambic pentameter, everything was in iambic pentameter. And it was fun to write. I felt some sense of control of the language when I would do that. And so when you're writing free verse, things can get pretty messy. And for me, when I talk about these tough topics, I don't necessarily want to get too messy on the page, because I think my point might get lost in that confusion. So I tend to try to stick with some very neat, some neat forms, and then I expand them into my own version of them, with a little free verse. I think for beginning poets, I would definitely suggest you learn the forms. You know, if you really enjoy poetry and you want to be someone who is skilled at your craft, learn forms and then deconstruct them. You know, you don't have to stick to them. You don't have to think that you can only be a poet if you rhyme, or you can only be a poet if you write an iambic pentameter. But I think it's wonderful to have those tools so you can find a form that maybe you enjoy working with, and then you can just tear it apart, you know, and make it speak in the way you want it to speak. And so for me, kind of controlled forms work for me, because I do deal with some tough subjects. And I think with the subjects that I deal with, it could get pretty messy in free verse if I allowed it to. So I like to keep things neat on the page if I can.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that for me, the poise of these poems, both kind of formally and voice wise, makes it more emotionally devastating and hard hitting sometimes for me. To to say something like the last line of this poem within a form and within a controlled voice is very, very powerful. Well, thank you
I'm
so
gonna
much. Yes, go.
maybe one more quick comment along the lines of what I said earlier and what you all really have added to my thinking. It's really been valuable. Those are really good insights about the control of this, because that was one thing that was striking me as well, is when you're dealing with, as you say, tough subjects, whether this is domestic, what was the word a little higher, just dominance, right? Or it goes further than that. It's a little ambiguous because we don't get the really precise, and I'm actually liking that in this context, all of the kind of details that can be overwhelming for a reader, right? Or even triggering for a reader, and very vulnerable for a writer. And that's something I talked to my students about yesterday when we listened to a lot of these stories, especially several of them in a row can be overwhelming. And so your control allows us to treat the topic without necessarily being overwhelmed at the same time. And I just think that I do appreciate that a lot. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the, I guess, best compliments I received from one of my professors in grad school was that my work was subtle and powerful. And I think that kind of speaks to who I am as a person. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Appreciate the questions and the very illuminating answers. And if you can hang around, Professor Lead, we might have more questions later in the event. If you're available, it'd be great.
Yeah, I'll be here.
Great. Okay, so we do have students who are going to be presenting some interpretation today as well. And just looking through the list of participants here, I think that's where we are at right now, unless any faculty poets have snuck in while I wasn't looking. I don't think that's the case. Speak up now, or forever hold your peace. But we have 4 students today who are going to briefly present parts of essays that they're working on about poetry from the Sligo Journal. Now, this is not a poetry class or a literature class. Both Professor LeBlanc's class and mine are working on essays about that take poetry from the Sligo Journal as their starting point. Of course, for me, it was just a brazen ploy to expose my students to the Sligo Journal, and I don't apologize for that at all. But also to coach students on doing a little interpretation of poetry and to introduce a compare-contrast format. So these are pretty challenging essays. So what you'll be hearing are pieces of works in progress, and I'll invite all my students jump in as well. And I'm just getting a direct message that there might have been some miscommunication. We might have other folks joining later, which will be fine because there will be time for that. Given that it might be likely that some of our other poets are going to show up later in this event, I'm going to adjust the order just a little bit from what I told the students before. And I think I'd like to start with Alexis from my class, who's going to be talking a little bit about some aspects of 2 poems from the Sligo Journal. And here comes Professor March. Okay, great. We're going to continue on with the students with some student interpretation right now. I certainly would not want to miss that, and we'll switch back to faculty readings in a little bit. So I'm going to share a couple poems really quickly from the Sligo Journal from issue 8 and issue 10, and we'll look at those really briefly, and then we'll have Alexis present a kind of an overview of some findings from that. Okay, so here's a poem that we're going to be looking at in Alexis's work, and I'll just ask for someone to read this poem from the screen out loud. Alexis, would you like to actually?
Yeah, it's fine. I'll
Great,
read it.
thank you.
What I Want by Anna Son. My mind is preoccupied these days because I'm not content. What? I don't have any friends, at least not in those ways. This summer I've been studying. It was, in truth, by choice. But all my girls and boys are always partying. Or so it seems on social things, always in pairs or groups or shares. At the beach, out of reach, in the air, everywhere. Without me, I'm at home. Without me, all alone. By myself with work to do, by myself dreaming of who will lift me from my longing, lift me from my misery. Embrace me in a tight love hug, or go do something fun with me. See a movie, eat some lunch, laugh out in the summer sun. Run with me, board with me, swim with me, fun with me. Just walk around and talk a while. Meet up nowhere and go 10 miles. Climb on roofs, take pictures, set up some nargle lures, root around in the forest in the dark of night. Throw some knives, 'cause why not? Fire the only light. Listen to music, drive a car. Love under the morning stars. Eat and talk incessantly. Pick up more friends. 1, 2, 3. Anything. Somebody call me. Stop excluding me. Stop not calling me. Do I have to ask? I don't know how. I need fun. I need it now or I'll burst. Maybe nobody's having as much as fun as I think they are. Maybe they totally are, and I'm missing out. What do I believe? I'm faint to be jealous. Come, come, I want fun. Come, come, I want fun. Help me, help me, help me, help me. Come, come, I want fun. Love me, be my friend. Friend, be my love.
Thank you, that was wonderful. Excellent reading of that poem. And another poem we have here is Quarantine by Gloria Jackson, who was a Montgomery College student, which was a second place winner in 2020. Okay, someone who's got a little, who's willing to go with a little swag in your voice. Deborah, do you feel like reading this one?
Sure, no problem.
Thank you.
Quarantine by Gloria Jackson. Confined to our minds, faced with this economical decline, we stand in line 6 feet behind. I guess they think we got all the time. I guess we are forced to believe that we can't leave or we will succumb to this so-called airborne disease. I bet they wish they kept them trees. Jobs shutting down, we can't even move around. This abandoned city seems deserted like a ghost town. I see how they keep us trapped and bound. Teachers instruct multiple courses while students at home with limited resources. 5G powers their virtual fortress. Yes, I can see the institutionalized forces. My pineal gland I activate to reach a conscious state. When my eyes awake, they try to vaccinate. So my vibrations I elevate. A socially distant separation starts to feel like segregation while everyone is in isolation. When will we get our emancipation? Proclamation.
Thank you for that reading. So this was written in the heat of the pandemic as we switched to virtual learning, and I'd just like to say in response to that poem, to repeat that everyone should get vaccinated. Okay, so let me turn it over to Alexis, and I'm going to reshare on Alexis's essay, and there we go. And which part of this essay, Alexis, were you going to focus on today?
The 6th paragraph. Another difference between what I want and quarantine is the rhyme used. In what I want, Son employs and rhyme in some stanzas. She makes the last word of every pair of lines rhyme. Or so it seems on social things, always in pairs or groups or shares, at the beach, out of reach, in the air, everywhere. In these lines, the words seems and things rhyme in the first and second lines, and pairs and shares in the third and fourth lines. Likewise, the words beach and reach rhyme in the fifth and sixth lines. And rhyme also occurs at the end of lines 7 and 8, which are the words air and where of everywhere. Moreover, there is another stanza in the poem that contains the same rhyming sound. Without me, I'm at home, without me, all alone. By myself with work to do, by myself dreaming of who. As it can be seen, the end of the first line rhymes with the second, and the third line rhymes with the fourth. These rhyming lines add a flow to the poem and make it have an emotional experience. On the other hand, Jackson uses internal rhymes in addition to end rhymes. Quarantine is a beautifully rhymed poem that presents numerous examples of internal rhymes. Here is a line from the poem that demonstrates Jackson's technique. My pineal gland I activate to reach a conscious state. When my eyes awake, they try to vaccinate. Notice that the internal rhymes activate, state, awake, and vaccinate are in the same line. A further example of a line that shows an effective internal rhyme pattern: a socially distant separation starts to feel like segregation, while everyone is in isolation. The rhyming words separation, segregation, and isolation emphasize the overall message of the poem. Jackson intentionally uses internal rhyme to make the poem more pleasurable to read and easy to remember. It also creates a musical effect due to similarities in stressed syllables of the words, emphasizing every third syllable. It gives the reader a musical experience because of the rhythms that set a pattern.
Thank you. I think that's a really well-constructed paragraph about the similarity in the rhymes there. So it sounds like you're in this part of your essay, you're talking about how the rhymes affect your experience as a reader, making it easy to remember, and I would say even like more powerful as well. Huh? Alexis, anything else you'd like to say about your analysis here in these poems?
I can read the my comparison for the tone.
Why don't, so in the interest of time, why don't you just tell us a little bit about that? Because that is kind of related to rhyme.
Oh, so the rhyme, the repetition of the words, like the part come, I want fun, come, I want fun, and help me, help me, help me. The stanza expresses the speaker's desperation by repeating the words, by begging repeatedly. The help me refers to the speaker asking someone to help get them out of their misery and satisfy their yearning. And the last line of the seventh stanza, the I want, need fun, I need it now or I'll burst, demands the audience give what they want in an urgent, forceful way. And all of these elements add to the poem's imploring, melancholy, and desperate tones.
Great, thank you. I think it's a really good. I think you focused really well on how sound affects the way a poem feels and what it means. I appreciate that. Good analysis. Let's go to some more student analysis here. Thank you, Alexis. And let's at this point go to, so wondering whether one of our other faculty poets will arrive late due to a miscommunication. So we will save two of our students for last in case that happens. But Nicole, are you game for presenting a piece of your work in progress?
Yes.
Great.
A third difference between Frisco Fat and Death is the speaker's personas. The personas of the two poems differ in their point of view and how each speaker confronts death. Abramoff uses first-person singular point of view throughout her poem. In the first stanza, the speaker says, "My mother a buyer, and I a down stench." The words my, I, and other first-person singular words are also used throughout the rest of Frisco Fat. Later in the poem, the speaker also says they are set between me and myself, and I open my lips, here I am, crooned. The use of me, myself, and I go on to show that the speaker is talking about themselves and only themselves, telling a story that is personal to them. Regarding death, the speaker seems to run towards it and embrace it, saying of themselves, I've hung up the future. And later they try to let their pulse fall, as if to stop fighting for their life. They're willing to walk towards death knowing they won't have it tomorrow. The speaker's feelings towards death are solidified by the last line saying, my fist pound out ripples, I wanted to die, expressing anger towards the fact that they are still alive. In contrast to Abramoff's singular form of storytelling, Abonran uses first-person plural point of view in order to address and include all readers, making them a part of the poem. From the start, the speaker lets the audience know that they will be included in the poem when saying, we all suffer from the same affliction. They go on to talk about how our thoughts, our sleep, our conversations, and our sense of self are affected by this affliction. This lets readers know that death is not a personal or a singular story, but a universal one that is felt by everyone. Though only mentioned in the title of the poem, the speaker sees death as something that brings great pain, saying, it penetrates our soul so deep, we cry to break it. However, the speaker confronts death by the end and comes to a realization about what it really means for humanity, accepting it but keeping their distance until it inevitably reaches them. Death ends with the final lines, it is not a statement of being, but rather an affliction of the living, an inanimate suffering. The speaker is essentially saying that death is no reason for being here or for being part of everyone, yet it does not make people who they are. The speaker appears as someone who knows where they stand in relative to the other forces of the universe. They don't like it, but they need themselves and others not only to know, but to understand that death has no personal vendetta or targeted rage. It merely exists, and its existence is what causes this pain. While poetry is a language art communicating with words, the story it tells is almost never just a story. Poetry's role is often to provide a forum for Abramoff, Abonran, and others to put words on a page in such a way so something greater can be formed. Whether it be a warning, a message, a deep and powerful feeling, or something else entirely, poetry is merely a means to communicate something that wants to be told. Death is a strong theme in both of the poems discussed. It is woven into each poem, whether implicitly or explicitly, knowingly or unknowingly, with each speaker asking, what does it mean to me? Whatever has happened in people's lives can all contribute to the vision of death. Some fear it and the day it will come, some accept that is the truth of their reality. Some fear and dread life so much that they willingly seek it out. Some may view it in entirely different ways. Regardless of what any one individual thinks of death, as Abonran wrote, it is inevitable. So regardless of what day it will come, in 1 week or 1 year or 1 century, maybe one should take the time to answer for themselves, what is death? And in the end, what does it all mean? No matter how many other poets like Abramoff or Abonran write about this subject, it should be remembered that a story is never just a story.
Thank you so much. And I encourage people to read those poems. They are quite elusive poems, and I'm really impressed at how Nicole has gotten so far into theme and what the poets are after here. When I had a meeting with Nicole about this poem, I was thinking about these poems, and I was thinking, oh boy, these are tough ones. And then Nicole started talking about her interpretation, and I said, well, wow, I did not see those things in the poem, so I think it's fantastic. I also appreciate your thinking about the function of poetry as well. Okay, we do have 2 more students to present their work. I just want to make sure, Alejandro Leopardi, are you in the house?
He came
I
in.
am.
Oh, great, great, great. I'm really glad you're here. Let's have you read your poem because we have 2 students who have interpretations that involve your poem. I'll put that up on the screen for us. So the floor is yours.
What if you take a walk because nothing else matters? What if, on that walk, you discover a field of sunflowers and lilies and dandelions? You choose to take your walk through that field to embrace the sensation of petals as they brush your skin, breathe in the scent of flowery promise. Each and every step taken creates flourishing blooms, the stalks growing taller, wilder, reaching high above you, enveloping you inside, preserving you. This is the perfect day, the culmination of warm, calm air, soft breeze, breeze, and cloudless skies. When you move your gaze away from the floral patch, shift your eyes upward. Nothing could be better than this moment right now, underneath the blanket of sun. What if, when your eyes return to that floral patch, it isn't that at all? What if, when your eyes search for the sunflowers and lilies and dandelions, they've vanished, dissipated in an instant? Those blossoms have been replaced by, or always have existed as, a field of wildflowers and weeds and shrubs. They've decimated a once magnificent landscape, turned it dull, lifeless. They never brushed you, but scrubbed and scraped, and the only sensation you feel is agony and sorrow. The walk becomes intolerable, excruciating. This is the worst day, the culmination of frigid, erratic air, commanding winds, and turbulent skies. You seek solace in the guiding warmth of the sun, but you look up to see it, too, has been supplanted by something more ominous, sinister even. What if these two fields are one and the same, existing concurrently? What if you are in one, but also in the other? You are entrenched in an endless tug and pull, each field overpowering at times, submissive at others. You cannot reconcile what one offers and what one takes away, submitting to a squandering crusade to find some semblance of peace, of tranquility. What if you never can? What if this is every day, the culmination of all that was, is, and could be? What if you're good enough? What if you aren't? What if you told someone how the world has turned dark, that the light that once shone bright has been extinguished forever? What if you told them how the field has become barren, its return impossible, no water, no sun, no replenishment? What if they listened? What if you told more people? What if they listened? What if they did something and you did nothing? What if we never know the answers to the what ifs? All we can do is see the people around us, truly see them. All we should do is look for the what ifs in those we care for. All we must do is understand how to uncover the what ifs that turn a field of flowers into a patch of weeds, that turn light into dark forever. What if you don't? What if no one does?
We have a couple students who will be looking at this poem. I'd like to, oh, and I would also like to point out that this poem, so we didn't ask, but this poem is also written in Spanish. Do you consider these the same weight? Was one written first?
The English was actually written first, and then the Spanish latter. So, the feelings and emotions came in English, but in Spanish it has a different kind of, appeal, I think.
Uh-huh. I urge everybody to check this out in issue 10. I also want to, if it's okay with you, I want to show the contributor's note as well, where you explain this poem a little bit. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
So the contributor's note at the end of the issue here says, Alejandro Leopardi composed this poem after the loss of a close friend of almost 30 years in summer 2020. Typically a positive, cheerful person, this friend struggled with the pandemic and the riots, the protests, and the ugliness it brought out in the world, so she chose to escape it all. So I would just like to say thank you for sharing this personal experience in an artistic way that shares it with all of us. Let's go to, we have two students. I'd like to go to Tobias first here. And so Tobias is comparing this poem with another poem, which is, let me just see, I've got a bunch of stuff on the screen. Okay, here we go. Providence by Abigail Beckel. In the interest of time, we won't look at that, and I'll put in the chat in a second where that is. That's in issue 6 of the Sligo Journal, if you go to the website. Tobias, what part of your essay would you like to focus on here today?
I think that was the first body paragraph. Like, I've moved it around, but I think in the original version, that's the first body paragraph.
Would you rather share a version from your screen?
Sure.
Okay.
A similarity between What If and Providence is that they both have the tone of an overwhelming sadness. An example of the consistent theme of depression in What If is the only sensation you feel is agony and sorrow. The person experiencing this depression is the reader. The field that the persona references throughout this piece is so much more than just that. It's how the reader is seeing the world at that moment. When the field is bright with a breeze, the reader is manic. When the field is cold, barren, and overgrown, the reader is depressed. In a similar fashion, in Providence, we see our protagonist Kate dealing with her own depression. Kate is impatient with her sadness. The overall scenery is a foggy December day.
Thank you for sharing that. Touching on not just word choice there with tone, but imagery. So the image of the field and how that affects the reader as well. Let's have one more student. Elizabeth is going to share some thoughts, and then we'll get some feedback from the poet on these. So I'll have you stop sharing, Tobias. Thank you.
And Professor Wall, Lisbeth has written on this, but I also had one other student, Mima, who did reporting a crime. If we have time,
Okay.
Mima was the one who kind of stayed in contact with me, Lisbeth. But yeah, it is pertinent right now. So if Lisbeth, if you're welcome to either share whatever insights you want to share, or you could read from your paper. How do you want to approach this, Lisbeth?
Oh wait, or was it Cherie? I'm sorry.
It was Lisbeth.
Okay, thank you.
I kind of just wanted to like share how I interpreted and then ask a question if that's okay.
Of course.
Okay, so when I was reading the poem, I kind of saw the field as a metaphor. I thought the flowers and the shining sun referred more to like the good aspects of someone's life, and then I saw the weeds and the wildflowers as the opposite. And then when at the bottom you combine them, I kind of saw them as like you telling the readers that life can be both. It doesn't have to stay bad or good. So I was just wondering, like, how did you want the readers to interpret the poem? Is that how you wanted them to see it, or was it different?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want anyone to interpret it one way or the other. I think that's actually a great interpretation of what you're reading and the imagery that it's supposed to uh, create. It's a bit of both. So the first part is actually an entire life's worth of feelings, whereas the latter half of it is mostly that day, the day, the friend decided to leave, and how an entire life's culmination of beauty can turn sour just in a moment. And I think that was the end. Is that, and in the end, you're battling with these two sides. Which one am I going to pick? Which side's going to win? And I think that's why I ended it the way that I did.
Thank you.
Yeah, questions throughout your poem, aren't there? We're asking you questions, but the poem asks us questions as well. Other thoughts or responses for Professor Leopardi or from Professor Leopardi about his poem before we move on?
Well, my hope is that not everybody gets too sad from this. My real way of viewing this, for me, was more a way to kind of purge my thoughts, my feelings, trying to understand what happened. But I realize that so many more people will deal with this daily. So, there is a constant battle. It's not one person and then the world, it's everyone together. So that was my real kind of reasoning behind writing this, and hoping that people get that out of it and not that's so much the sadness part of it.
Thank you. I also took it as a reminder to check in on some people. Make
Absolutely,
sure I'm in contact. Yeah. Thank you.
I
Okay,
can-
great. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
I'll just say really quick that for me, and goes along with what you were saying, Professor Leopardi, is that there's always it's kind of cliche to say the silver lining thing, but I try to be optimistic. And when you were saying this is a dark day, but don't lose sight of the utopic possibility of every day, right? That's something I try to keep my mind focused on. But it's sometimes really hard, especially in really rough times like we had a year ago. You can lose sight of that. But I really like that you reminded me of that. And I like that poem for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And then, going back to what Professor Wall said, is that idea of checking in on some people, because where you might see someone as being one thing, they might be something else, and you never know until you ask. So, we try to keep positive and optimistic, but that doesn't mean that everyone can do that all the time. So, yeah, thank you.
Before we move on, I just want to invite Tobias, if you have any questions, since you're working with Professor Leopardi's poem.
Yeah, my biggest question, and again, thank you for sharing, is what made you decide to write it in that format? The format of simply questions. I thought it was very interesting because it kind of leaves the reader a little bit still wanting answers themselves. Like, did you go into it thinking that you would be asking questions towards the reader? Did you think that you were trying to answer questions that you yourself were facing, and so you were putting those questions on paper, or what exactly was that process like?
It actually, it was both. You know, it's the questions that, you know, that we all ask when someone, you know, passes. We ask these questions all the time. What happened? What was, you know, what did they see that I didn't see? But it's also, I'm asking readers to ask themselves the same questions. You know, why did someone see this turn so dark so quickly? So I want it to be reciprocal, so that we're both asking the questions. I'm asking questions, but I'm asking the readers a question as well. And I thought about it that way: is that when someone passes, it's the first thing we start doing. Like, well, what happened? I don't understand, and you're trying to figure it out. So it is one of those you know, concepts where we are trying to understand at the same time we're understanding.
Thank you for answering.
Thank you.
Greg, if possible, I might call your attention to a quote that Professor Lee was sharing. Seems very apropos of Humanities Days.
Yes, in the chat. What do we ask of poetry, of art, if not to put us in actual touch with the difficulty of human existence? Joshua Wiener. Yeah, indeed, the difficulty of human existence. And, a powerful poem can make us aware of that in ways that we haven't been before, for sure. Okay, so we have another student who it will be giving us some thoughts on a particular poem in the Sligo Journal. And first, I just want to show you really briefly where this comes from. A poet and colleague named Jonah Coulson writes these kind of poems that have been dubbed dialogue poems. We won't read the whole thing right now, but in the dialogue poem, there's somebody like a job interviewer or something, and then there's someone else responding to that persona. So there's two speakers, and the person responding often goes off into flights of poetic fancy. So, for example, what if you were at a job interview and they asked you, why are you interested in this position? And you said, they say the man who invented the steam engine was inspired by watching a tea kettle. You might get the job, you might not, but it would be an awesome poetic thing to do. We'll turn it over. And Michael, would you like to introduce the student?
Sure. Maima, are we able to look at the actual poem? Like, do you have it handy?
You're right. Yes, I do. Thank you for reminding me. You go share back again.
So Maima, are you here and available? I know you said you had a class.
Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Awesome. So
Okay.
we'll start by reading
for Harper
the poem.
Right.
And there we go. So this won first place in the 2020 issue. Well, in our poetry contest in 2020. You know, it's fun to read it, I think, with two voices. Would you be open, Professor Wall, with me and Maima read it?
You bet.
Maima, do you want to do the questioning, maybe?
Yeah, I'll do the question.
Okay, cool. And I'll do the other. Okay, so I would like to report a crime.
What is the crime?
Last night, as I slipped through the door, another entity joined me.
Do you know the assailant?
Only in the way human beings know other human beings. They looked as foreign as my reflection in the mirror.
What do you remember about them?
The smell of sunlight, the taste of heartbreak, what want looks like reflected back on you.
Walk me through the evening.
I met my coworkers after our daily sacrifice. We laughed until we cried. I hated their faces more than I hated my own. I tangoed home.
Alone?
I was more alone with them than with myself.
Did you drink?
Only the stars. It bubbled and burned as it slid down.
Were you drunk?
on dreams and fascinations, on deliberate notions to overhaul the sorrow silver-lined sky.
What were you wearing?
The idea of clothing, it knits itself around you until you cannot breathe.
How did they restrain you?
With their mouth, my stomach turned itself inside out. My viscera practiced arpeggios until they exhausted themselves to unconsciousness.
Did you say no?
I couldn't speak. I traded my voice to Ursula in a bid for love. Why didn't anyone tell me not to put my money in the stock market?
Did they steal anything from you?
Nothing that hadn't been stolen before.
Thank you for that reading. And do we have some writing to show, or would you like to talk about the poem? Or
Yeah, I'll just talk about the poem for my,
okay, great.
Yeah. And my understanding of the poem is that of a woman who calls a cop to report a crime done against her, but the cop interrogated her in such a way that felt victimizing. And for example, he was asking her about the clothing she was wearing and if she was drunk. That should have nothing to do with the crime. However, she was able to pretend like she was not hurt and responded to every line of his questioning, turning every question the cop asked her into a beautiful word of art and not giving into his victimization or the true crime itself.
Thank you for crystallizing that part of the poem for me. When you put it in a context like that, it has a lot of power.
Can I just say a quick word?
Of course.
Yeah, I love that interpretation. That's really great. I think the student hits the nail on the head there. I would also say that from my point of view, like this is like a opportunity here. The poet just lets her imagination go, and it's like she's gonna, despite how constraining it is to have this kind of interrogation, she, through her poetic imagination, sort of wriggles out of it in a way, and she controls the situation, and she figures out how to respond in this incongruent way that gives her the control. And there are times when poetry works that way, many times for us, where we don't really like what the reality of the situation gives us, but if we can use our poetic imaginations, perhaps therapeutically, or perhaps just in a way that allows us to get a different perspective on a difficult situation, our own poetry can be extremely important, at least to us, as well as clearly to some of our readers as well.
I agree 100%. Great stuff coming in the chat too. People saying no surrender. You can use your poetry to resist. I love it. So we have about 7 minutes left here, and we have 2 more. So thank you so much for that interpretation. I really appreciate that. We have 2 more faculty poets who have joined us, and maybe we will have the final minutes of this be just some enjoyment of hearing a couple poems. We might have time for questions and answers. We might not, but we can go out with some more poetry. So we have Sydney March in the house, who's going to read a poem called Cuba/Jamaica, Jamaica. And we have Albert Kapikian in the house, who is going to read a poem called Every Madness Has His Miles. If it's okay with you, we'll start with Professor March. Let me see if I can find it here. Oh, there it is right there.
Beyond the roving clouds, I embraced your shadow across barriers of consonants and vowels, and gazed at the blue thread of 92 miles I could not cross. From the fringe of mangroves, I watched the agile boats, the seagulls, swift and recklessly, dance carelessly on swells, and imagine the splash of Carib's oars, long silenced by time. Our grandparents' parents once stood naked at the edge of hopeless voyages, and dreamed of sweltering cane fields at the end of hopelessness, or the waves slapping its palm to agitate the broad waters that separates the living from the dead. My memories, like yours, are sometimes nightmares of uncertain voyages when we cowered in the holds of slave ships. But that time has come. We weep into music and dance into dreams, I think. Your rumba and my reggae shout songs of love, laughter, and lament. We now speak eloquently in the tongues of pirates who pillared those sacred rhythms, and under watchful eyes of old men and roving clouds, adrift like dandelions, we our losses, live, love, and swoon to the music of throbbing drums. Let's forget old griefs and crumbled dreams of uncertain voyages. Let's mock the winds and tides and abandon the perfect blades of our machetes. Send your canoa back to me. Send it full of rhythms across those 92 miles of blue that braid our destinies with those of the invincible dead.
Thank you. That's a great poem. I always appreciate the chance to have students meet you and hear you read your work as well. So thank you so much for sharing. In the interest of time, we'll
Thank you.
great. In the interest of time, we'll see if there's any questions after. But let's go to Professor Kapikian.
Hey, thank you, Professor Wall. Every madness has its miles. Mine was the walking on the rails, the head down walking on the rails, and the rain was mine. If I was sad, I wasn't broken when I went walking on the railroad tracks, where I went looking for the spokens, the ancient spokens inside the depots and the dead ends, where I found my family and made my friends. Every madness is its miles. Mine was the walking on the rails, the head down walking on the rails, and the rain was mine.
Thank you. These are all some of my favorite poems in the world, by the way, that we've been hearing today. So it's just such a privilege to get to hear from the people who wrote them and hear them read them. We do have a couple minutes left. If there are any questions, comments for Professor Kapikian or Professor March. I see a couple things in the comments, people just echoing lines with those of the Invincible Dead. Professor Leopardi said, so much energy. Professor Boss said, love how history and time is told with all the senses. I agree 100%. Other questions or comments in about 1 minute? Someone said, can I see the spoken line again? Yes, the ancient spokens. Looking for the spokens, the ancient spokens. I'll try to go down a little bit so we can see more of it. So I always have it cranked way up so that we can read it well. But then you don't get to see as much of the poem at a time. Students working on this poem often deal with sound as well as imagery. Students working with Professor March's poem also often dealing with sound and imagery. So it is 2:30, so we should wrap up. If anybody wants to hang around and chat in a little bit after I turn off the recording, that's fine. I have time, and anyone who wants to is welcome to. Kind of the standing around the desk at the end of the class equivalent over Zoom.
Professor Wall, could I say too? I will stick around for a couple of minutes afterwards in case somebody might have more questions about the student poetry contest. I'll be happy to answer those.
Awesome.
I just put Professor Lott's email into the chat. If you want to write that down, if you have a poem or would like to write a poem for our poetry contest, due date is towards the end of November, I believe, Professor Lott. So please consider it's $100 for first place at the bookstore, to spend at the bookstore, and $50 for second. So there is a money prize there. So please submit your poetry to Professor Lott. Again, email in the chat.
I should add too that in addition to being published, we usually have an event after the publication, a sort of launch event where people who have been published in that issue get an opportunity to read, just as you heard poets read today. And also fiction writers get to read their work, students, faculty, staff, whoever's work ends up being published in the particular issue. So it's really a nice opportunity. And I also feel as though I should thank, Professor Wall especially for moderating all of this, for getting this session today together. There aren't really that many opportunities that I know of at the college where so many faculty, poets, writers can get together with students who are both interested in poetry and writing, either writing critically about it, that is to say, writing a paper about it, but also writing their own work. So it's just a very nice opportunity. Now, I think it's the second year in a row, at least, that we've done this kind of a session in Humanities Days, and I hope we can continue to do that. I just really love the combination of people at the college that it brings together, the opportunities for discussing this that it creates. So thanks, Greg. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks to everybody who writes poetry and puts together the journal, to you all and people showing up today, and to the artists. There's also visual art in the Sligo Journal. If you're a fiction writer, this was about poetry, but you can submit your fiction as well. And if you're looking for a so what for your conclusion of your essay, I think one logical so what in there is look at the amazing creativity and the creative community that we have at Montgomery College. This journal is based at the Takoma Park Silver Spring campus. Of course, it's also college-wide, but it is an amazing community, and I'm really proud to be a part of it. And thank you all so much for attending. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of Humanities Days.